Now we're going to talk about a group of poses that really requires and asks for a lot of hip mobility and hip flexibility. Some of these are seated poses, some of these are more standing poses, but in terms of the key actions, like the key body movements that are going on, it's really hip focused. The first pose that we're going to start with is splits, frontal splits, which we call Hanuman Asana. We've practiced Ardha Hanuman or half split quite a bit in the classes, which is a great way to prepare for splits, and it's also a krama or a stage of splits. Before we even get there, as we've talked about, it's really important that you understand what your current ability is, what your current hip flexion ability is in both legs, and what your current hip extension is in both legs. And to understand in your own body if you are being stopped by tension, which is changeable resistance, tensile resistance via your muscles, fascia, joint capsules, skin, or if it's compression, meaning the body running into itself, leg running into the arm, or the end game is a bone running into another bone, and then it just can't go any further than that. We have to know that before getting into or trying to get into these poses, so that, you know, if we're at our maximum, if we're at compression and there's more space left, like from hips to the floor, for example, in splits, that we don't force our body to go the rest of the way. This, in my opinion, is one of the main reasons we see people's hips turning to the side or not staying square or not being able to be square in poses like splits and in poses like Warrior One, where the legs are doing the same, the hips are doing the same movements. One's doing flexion, one's doing extension in the back. And once you reach your current maximum, your hips are going to turn open. So anyway, we're going to talk about that as we move through the preparatory movements and the kramas of Hanuman Asana. And I would have blocks whenever you're going to be exploring your hip range of motion. So I would start in a low lunge kind of thing with either leg. And this is something I often do at the beginning of classes, just in general, to get, you know, some hip mobility. I might, you know, put the blocks on or my hands on the inside of my foot too. It just depends on your proportions. So in this pose, my front leg is in flexion and my back leg is in extension. Really what I'm focusing on here is the opening or the stretching of the back leg right here, right? I have to stretch my hip flexors because those muscles are going to be the ones that are going to restrict my hip extension, right? Because they do the opposite thing. So anyway, I would be in low lunge and I would just pause here for a second until I really feel that. And then I would maybe breathe in and then breathe out and move into Ardha half Hanuman, half splits. As I pull my sit bone back, I can stretch my hamstrings and the hamstrings connection to the lower back. Your hamstrings and your lower back are going to limit your hip flexion and your knee extension too. And sometimes you feel the stretch sufficiently that you don't have to straighten this leg. And I wouldn't force that either. I would just pull your sit bone back until you feel like a reasonable stretch in the belly of the muscle. And I like to create a circuit and go back and forth, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. So it's like this slow tick-tock motion back and forth, and I'm really focusing on this hip movement, opening up the hips, warming up the muscles around the hips, and specifically when we're talking about splits, frontal splits, Hanumanasana, is in the sagittal plane. So we have flexion movements and we have extension movements. So we've got to warm up and prepare the body in that same plane. So Ardha Hanuman and lunge are both in the sagittal plane. They're both flexion and extension movements. You don't have to do this a million times. You could do like just pausing in each shape maybe 3 times for like a breath or 2 each time, or you might just go back and forth maybe 3 to 5 times. And then you would do the other side. The first time I come into these, I give myself a little bit more time. I like to just pause here instead of going back and forth right away, to give the muscle fibers a chance to really receive the stretch and to lengthen, and to feel in my mind where I'm feeling the most stretch. Here, for example, I'm feeling the stretch in the back, right, which is tensile resistance, but I'm feeling it more on the inside of my inner leg. You've got 3 hamstrings, not just 1. So I'm just keeping that in mind, like, oh, maybe it's, also I gotta stretch my inner thighs, my adductors, maybe it's more like semimembranosus, just like, extra information for me. You could even add arm movements into this if you were sequencing or in a class, right? You could come forward, reach your arms up, and then exhale and go back. Inhaling forward, exhaling back. And then other forward bends, like Uttanasana, the standing forward fold, which is, if you're in a flow class or a Hatha yoga class, you typically do that a number of times in the Namaskar cycle or the warm-up cycle of class anyway, so you're getting a chance to stretch the whole back side of the body, which in splits will help you free up the front leg. And then things like high lunge and warrior 1 will help you stretch the hip flexors, which is going to free up your back leg in splits. As far as kramas go to Hanuman Asana, Ardha Hanuman is basically the best way to get yourself prepared for that, to move into splits as the first krama, and I would have blocks. I would have blocks, especially if you are you're still learning and exploring what your ranges of motions are in your hips, starting in Ardha Hanumanasana, half splits. This is the first stage. To progress forward, you would slide this front heel forward. You could keep your back knee where it was, but it depends on how long your mat is too. So I could slide my front heel forward a couple of inches. There's no right or wrong amount that you slide forward, it's just an exploration. And you can see when I do that when I slide my front heel forward, my back hip is going into more extension, right? This one. And the blocks help me to more safely explore my range. And if I don't have the hip mobility or flexibility to get down to the floor, my blocks are gonna help give me that. So let's say you're, pretty far, like this is pretty far into full splits, but like I can't get down anymore. I could just use one of the blocks that I have and put it under my bum on that side. I could even put the other one under my, this leg, and essentially bring the floor up to me and work like this. So I could take some of the work out of my arms, I could lean forward and work more of the stretch in this leg, or I could be more upright and work more of the stretch here. Because this is like doing a forward fold, right? So when you forward fold, I'm gonna be, preferentially stretching more of this front leg. If I'm up higher, then I'm gonna pull more on my hip flexors and I'm gonna preferentially stretch more of what's going on in this leg. When you're ready to backtrack out of your exploration, you would bring your hands or fists down to the floor, slide your heel in. If you had blocks under there, you would remove them. Slide all the way back, and then I would bend your front leg, maybe come back into tabletop, and then do child's pose. Something that gets the tension out of your hamstrings. So you start in Ardha Hanuman, half split, slide your front foot forward or plunk it forward. Sometimes because I start to run out of mat space, I also walk this knee backwards a bit, this back leg. I'll keep my hands on my blocks, tuck my back toe under and walk backwards as well, just so I have, more of my mat space to work with. I'll walk my hands back so I'm more vertical in my torso. I'm really using my arms, I'm really pushing down to get the weight out of my hips. And then here, I like to just kind of hang out and explore, so I'm letting my hips kind of float in the middle. And I'll even sometimes just rotate my shoulders a little bit, which makes my hips rotate a little bit, and I just explore where I feel the most resistance. At some point over many months, it might take that long, or even longer, you will, without having forced yourself down, you will be able to get down as low as you can go. That doesn't mean you're gonna be able to do a straight line, 180 degrees. It depends on the structure of your body. It depends on the structure of your hips. Just because I can stay down here doesn't mean that I want to stay in this kind of position. Maybe I still wanna have my hands on my blocks anyway, because I like that extra lift I get out of my pelvis, and I can explore like what happens when I lift up and I square more. Like when I bring this hip bone more to the front, how does that feel? Versus taking it out to the side a little bit, which might be hard to see, but that is happening somewhat in this hip as I come down. Personally, to give my hips more space, my front foot is like more towards the front outer corner, and my back foot is more towards the back outer corner. Let me show you from a different angle. From the side view, you wouldn't really notice that, but it's something I like to do just to give my hips and my back more space. And it's something I teach to people about, you know, the standing poses, Warrior 1, Warrior 2, lunge. Give your hips and your feet more space widthwise so that your hips don't have to turn as much. So what I mean is when I slide forward and come down, my foot isn't like directly straight in the middle of the mat. I like to take mine out a little bit towards the side, and then I walk my back hip back, and when my leg is down back there, my foot isn't in the middle of my mat, it's more to the back left. So my legs are somewhat abducted. They're taken out to the side, both of them. And that's not right or wrong, it's just something you might want to think about to give yourself more play room, more wiggle room, because probably it's going to be harder if you try to keep your feet more directly in a straight line, because it's a strong direct stretch for your hamstrings and your lower back. And by abducting, by taking the legs out to the side, it's a slightly more gentle stretch, and I'm able to get down here and work at a pretty low stage down here. But I still like to have the block so I can kind of play and turn like this, because it helps me to access stretches around my psoas connection here that I just wouldn't be able to get if I just was being still. I like to kind of float. You could even be at an earlier stage and just kind of play a little bit, as long as you have that support and lift with your arms. To come out, I would use my hands on the floor or the blocks, lift up, and then slide the front leg back. You might find that one hip just doesn't flex or extend the same way that the other side did. So for me, I've noticed that over time, that when I come down on the other side where my right leg is going back into extension, that I actually do feel compression. And it's harder to sense, but you know what that means now. You know what compression is. When I'm going into splits this way, with my right leg going into extension now instead of being the one in the front, I feel compression. I feel the compression. It's like deep in the glute where the bone, the pelvis is running into the femur and being stopped, or like the tissue itself is being pinched. And that's telling my brain when I feel that, and it's kind of like a dull pinching feeling in there. It's telling me that I can't extend this back leg anymore. I'm done extending. So if I wanted to get all the way down onto the floor, maybe the mat is too dark. Let me just get rid of this so you can see better. So on this side, if I cannot extend this back leg anymore, that means I can't get it down to the floor. I can't get that one down to the floor by pushing more, because that's more hip extension. And my body's trying to tell me, you're at your maximum hip extension right now. So to get down all the way, the rest of the way, I'd either have to get more hip flexion in the front leg to get down, and I might have to lean my body forward more, right? Because if I sit myself upright more, this is more hip extension here, or I'd have to rotate. I'd have to rotate my hips open and try to get around that compression, rotate my hips open to the side, oops, and be in splits like that, not square to the front, if I wanted to get my butt all the way down. That's, you know, this is splits too, I would argue. This is full splits too. This is my full splits being square on this side. That's what it is. You know, if we think that full splits has to mean for everyone that your hips are square to the front and your butt is on the floor, not everyone is going to be able to attain that version of full splits. You are going to move into or grow into your full expression of Hanumanasana. And as I'm trying to show you that for me, at least right now, my full expression is different on my left side versus my right side, but I don't consider myself not in full splits, right? Like, especially if I feel my body telling me, like, hey, you're at compression back here, I'm not gonna try to force or go beyond that, because that's not yoga anymore. And so this is gonna be my full splits if I'm gonna stay square, and I can stay upright on the blocks. If I don't wanna get, you know, the extra hip flexion to get down there, and I don't want to roll my hips open to get there. But I could do this too. I wouldn't call this cheating per se. It's a body strategy. Like, if your hips are turning open, it's probably because you're at compression or you have a lot of tensile resistance and your body's trying to protect itself by rotating away from the strain. Now, although this isn't wrong, it's not like pure frontal splits, because now my body's kind of facing this way instead of this way. It's putting my muscles on a different stretch, like things are being stretched at a slightly different angle than they would be if I was here. Is this wrong? No, not necessarily. If this doesn't feel good or you feel in pain, then that's not right. You're gonna get probably a more efficient stretch though if you work up higher and stay in the sagittal plane, because here I'm playing with the transverse plane. Here I've had to externally rotate my hip to do this. I'm having to rotate this way. So I've mixed two planes. It's not just sagittal plane movements anymore. So if I'm trying to do frontal splits, I should probably do my best to stay in the sagittal plane. So I would take the blocks down and do that. I would work here and just honor my body's architecture, honor my body's anatomy. I like to do that too, what I just did, to really stretch my hip flexors on this side. I like to tuck the back toes under and float and really press back like this. When I'm ready to come down, again, bring that back knee down. If it was up, slide the front heel in, and then you can move forward or take a break. I know we've gone over the idea of tension and compression so many times, and I don't mean to insult your intelligence by repeating it, but it's not something I was taught in either my 200-hour or my 300-hour, and it's such an empowering thing because it lets you keep your mind in your own body and be your own teacher when you are going into these poses. And it changes the focus of the pose, not to attain someone else's full splits because they have their own body structure. It helps us to be in poses and figure out when we are in our own full expression of these poses. And so we can model our asanas off of what we see and what we're taught and the general body movements, but your teachers and the books that you see these poses done in, you know, those people have their own body architecture too. And if they have joint structures and mobility that really is rewarded in certain poses and makes things like splits and all these flexible things very simple, then it might make us feel like we can't do the pose. But one of the key take-home messages of my teaching, period, is that your yoga is going to look different from somebody else's yoga. You might find certain poses more easy than someone else, and they might find poses that are easier for them that are hard for you. And it's the beauty of individual variation in human anatomy, which isn't the same. And it's gonna prevent you from hurting yourself. That's something too. We want to practice care for ourselves and ahimsa, and not beating ourselves up that we can't do it the way it should be done, because that's not a real concept. There's no way it should be done physically. Everyone's got different joints, and I'm trying to show you, even in my own body, having practiced for a really long time, and I do have a very mobile, flexible body in many ways, but you're going to eventually reach your wall. You're going to eventually reach compression in any movement, and that's gotta be okay, and it's gotta be fine. What am I here for anyway? I really like doing splits because it gives me such a satisfying stretch through my hip flexors and through my hip extensors that other poses don't always give me. And so that's why I go into that. That's what I do it for. I also like doing poses, the same movements, but in different orientations, because turning a pose around on its sides can make it really different. And I've made this comparison before with downward facing dog and boat pose, because they're both like V shapes, right? But boat pose feels really different than downward facing dog feels, even though they're the same body movements, more or less, because you're at a different orientation to gravity. And so you're gonna have to work more or less hard depending on your orientation to gravity. On that note, I'd like us to also play with standing splits. On the floor, your leg and hip muscles are more relaxed because you're not standing upright. So the joint spaces are more open. But when you're standing and you try to bring your leg up into a split, even if you can get really far on the floor, it might be a lot different when you try to do the same pose at a different angle to gravity. And I like doing that because it helps you more passively explore your range of motion and more actively explore your range of motion. So let's talk about standing splits now, which in Sanskrit is Urdhva Prasarita Eka Padasana. Literally that means upward spread out 1 foot pose, but we can just call it standing split. For this one, I would have prepared already with the prior poses, with Ardha Hanuman and kramas between Ardha Hanuman and full Hanumanasana, wherever you are comfortable with. So you can get into standing splits from a variety of ways. I like to get into it from Uttanasana, which is the standing forward fold. You could use blocks or not. And you could have the legs a little bit bent or not. And here you would be hanging forward, you get your hands down onto something. You would have to shift your weight to one leg. That's going to be the standing one, your platform. You could extend the back leg out lightly and then start to lift it up. This is more like a warrior 3 setup here, right? This L shape with the legs. To get into standing split from here, I would have to flex my front hip more, which means bow down into Uttanasana, right? And then get my back leg up into as much extension as it can get. And for me, if I'm gonna stay purely in the sagittal plane, which is like Lego man movements, and not rotate my hip open in the back, this is pretty much what I can do. So I'm actively coming into extension back here. And it's a very strong active stretch for my bottom leg too. If I wanted to get that back leg up higher, then I would actually, for myself, I would rotate the top leg into external rotation. So to get my leg up higher, if that's something I wanted to do, I would rotate it to the side. My knee would actually rotate open a little bit, and then whoa, I can get up a lot higher than I could before, because I've combined, I've combined 2 movements there, keeping a slight bend in my front leg, extending the back leg up. This is as much as I can get really working. This is not bad either. This is giving me lots and lots of glute strength and leg control. But if I liked that free feeling, I would rotate this hip
the lifted one open, and then I can get around that compression and work my glutes at a different angle. Obviously, it's a big stretch here too. It's like doing splits, you're just standing up. My legs are both very active. And this is hard enough. Some people like to make it even harder by trying to get the hands off of the floor and get them onto the ankle. And I've never really succeeded in being able to hold that for very long. But the idea is you would find your balance, get your hands one at a time onto your ankle and balance like that. And to come down, you would get your hands back down. I would bend the bottom leg, bend the top leg, and bring them back down together. If there's anything else I would add that's helpful for standing splits, since your adductors get stretched more if you're going to externally rotate your top leg, I would do some external rotation in both hips first as well, right? Something like Baddha Konasana to open up in here. Okay, now I would like to talk about another hip flexibility pose that combines the sagittal plane and the transverse plane, which is compass pose, or Parvrita Surya Yantrasana. Literally, this means revolved sundial pose, and it involves hip flexibility, hamstring flexibility, just like splits did, but now we're gonna be including the shoulders and some rotational elements as well. This we're going to do as a prelude to Bird of Paradise because it's very similar. The movement is very similar, but you're sitting down on the floor, so you have a little bit less to think about than when you're in Bird of Paradise. This is something I would do towards the end of your practice when your hips are warmed up, your hamstrings are more open, when you've done some twisting and some side bending already, because all of those things are going to make this feel more easeful. Instead of doing Bird of Paradise in that class that I provided, you could just take that out entirely and just practice compass pose if you wanted to do that instead. I offered a lot of poses in that class already and ways to warm up, but specifically Ardha Hanuman, half splits, seated twists, side bends, and shoulder opening is really helpful, which is why in that class we did a lot of binding. We did lots of shoulder stuff and like wrapping the arms around the legs, because that essentially happens in this pose. So in sundial pose, one leg can start bent on the floor, and it might not go down as far as that. You know, if this is as much as you can rotate, then that's what it is. The other leg, this one, is going to be eventually shelved on my shoulder. Okay, and then I would grab my foot and open it up, and that would be the full posture. But just understanding first, before you get into that, that to shelf your arm, you would have to round and shelf, okay? Hold your foot and then open. So what does that mean? What does that entail? This, right? Like what's gonna stop me from opening all the way up into the full pose? So here, if this is where I get and I feel a lot of stretching in here, then I've got to focus on more side body opening instead of being here and like really trying to force my way into it. I've got to kindly and over time stretch my triceps, lats, lower back connection in side body stuff. But also proportion. Your proportion is going to affect this pose for sure. And other poses where you're trying to do like this kind of thing. There's another really crazy pose, which will be in another section, which is a combination pose called Vijma Mitrasana. And it's like side plank plus this essentially. But to get your arm over your head like that, your proportion between your upper body and your leg can affect this. So I have a longer torso just as an example, because this is what I'm working with. You know, I gotta scrunch down quite a bit here. I gotta round my back a lot to grab my foot, because my upper body is, you know, longer than my lower body altogether. So I gotta round and scrunch and then try to open. So for me to get into full sundial pose, I'm gonna probably have to rotate more. than someone else with like a shorter torso and longer legs. So the first stage would be sitting, one leg bent underneath you like this, the other leg coming up, and we would have to make a shelf for it by getting the body inside, right? Not on the outside. You'd have to lean forward, make a shelf, or you could also lean back, cradle this leg, and make a shelf like this. But in any case, you have to round and get your leg over your arm. So here's the front view, right? So just to be in this first krama, I really got to lean forward, and my shoulder is going forward as well. So this would be like krama 1. And then the next stage would be grabbing your foot with your hand. You can grab the outer edge of the foot, like the pinky edge, with the hand and wrap it around like this. I'll come up and show you more clearly. So when I've come up and made my shelf, I would take this hand and wrap it around the outside like this. You can also grab around your big toe, but just be kind and don't yank on it too hard. And if you have a longer torso, you might want to give yourself more height and make it easier to get your head through by taking your hand up higher. And then the challenge is opening, straightening this leg essentially, and then holding onto the foot and rotating at the same time. So this is what? This is hamstring flexibility, which is why preparing and opening your hamstrings first is really helpful. Side body opening and twisting is really helpful. And then the idea is you would rotate and open. Now, because of my proportions, I've got such a long upper body, I find it much more comfortable to do this when I actually lift this hip, this bum, off of the floor, because it's giving me more height. So let me show you. Making the shelf, getting the foot, and then when I start to open, I try to like get my head through here. I could even take my arm out to the side like that, that's fine. And I'm gently pushing my arm into my leg. I could try to stay down here, but I really gotta lean this way. Or I could lift my butt off of the floor, okay? Give my leg more height to match my upper body more. It's easier for me. It's easier for me to stay upright, to rotate. And when I'm actually here, I feel super side stretch down here in my lower side. I feel a stretch here in my underarm area. Hence the importance of doing those things before. Stretching your side body, doing twists, stretching your hamstrings. To get out of this, you could keep that strong connection of your shoulder and your leg, so I'm pressing them together. Release your foot, bring it down, bend your leg, bring your foot down, uncross. And I would just pause in something symmetrical before you do the other side, because that's a strong twist that you're doing in that pose. So I wouldn't say that doing the pose with the sit bones grounded or one lifted is wrong or right. I think it depends on your proportions. Neither is a superior way. It's just what makes your body more comfortable. I wanted to put compass pose before bird of paradise or Svarga Dvijasana because there's a lot of similar movements involved, but now we have standing balance. The setup for this one is kind of complicated and it involves a lot of shoulder mobility. When you're actually up in the pose, you're going to be set up similarly to how you were in compass, but instead of holding your foot, the idea is that you bind around your back. And I used a strap in that class because your proportions can affect your ability to clasp. And because one leg is in a lot of flexion and then extending up straight, it's got a lot of the splits feeling in it too, which is why it's good to do like splits warm-up poses before you attempt bird of paradise for sure. So all of the preparatory poses for splits and compass are going to help you combined for bird of paradise. The kramas of bird of paradise, when you're ready to get into it or play with it, you got to start in a standing forward fold. To get into the pose, like the first setup position is you would probably take your feet wider because we're going to have to like get in between the legs and bind around one of the legs. So I would take my feet actually much wider to give my upper body more space. And then one of these legs is gonna end up being shelved on my arm, and that's the one I'm gonna hug from like a reverse hug. So let's say I'm gonna hug my left leg first. So if that's the one I'm gonna hug, just like I did for compass, this arm on the same side is gonna end up being its shelf. So I would bow forward, and I like to really bend the leg that's gonna come up. So I'm gonna come up onto my tiptoes, which makes the knee bend. And I would play with that idea of making a shelf. And this might be Krama 1, even though we're not bound yet, I would still practice this as like an early Krama stage, especially with someone who's just getting comfortable with it.
And then we have to work on the shoulder bind, and I would have done that already in something like side angle pose. But from that place, when you've practiced this, I would reach and practice making your first connection with the arm that's gonna wrap around the leg. Do you see how when I reach under there, my arm is gonna have to turn in. My shoulder's gonna rotate in, and my hand is now facing you. So that would happen. I would reach, my arm would turn as much as I could, and then I could just bend my elbow and get it onto my back. From that, we could practice the full bind. So I would bend one leg, get the arm back, practice the half bind. I could take this other arm up. I have to turn it around the same way, rotating it in, bend the elbow, and then the idea is the hands connect. But of course that depends on your proportions. So you could always have a strap or a towel in between, like this. So you could call this the first Krama, but you can see that there's a lot of stuff that had to happen to get here. So if you want to be really nice to your students or nice to yourself, then break down those bigger stages into even smaller stages. Because just getting here is asking for a whole lot of stuff to go right. All right, but let's say that we're here now. We've hugged our leg from behind. Now what's going to have to happen? Well, this leg that I'm hugging is going to end up in the air with me, and this leg, the other one, is going to stay on the floor. So that means I have to stand up somehow. So to do that, I would bend this leg a lot. I would push down into my heel and bring my hugged leg up into standing. This is a tough maneuver. I would definitely think about your core pulling in towards the center and make sure that your shoulders are comfortable when you come up. And this takes a lot of strength to, bring myself up like this. I'm not gonna lie, it's really hard. So I would push down. It's like a ton of leg strength with this standing leg. And to be able to stand up like this, do you see how like my hips are really open? It's kind of like this kind of thing. Like I end up in a really deep standing lunge when I'm up here. So it's not exactly like compass, because we held the foot and opened it, but it's similar in the sense that we have the leg shelved, and we're going to straighten this leg. Maybe not, this is a big accomplishment, just having stood up like this. And again, you might have the hands around in the back with a strap. Maybe you just want to work this one arm too. Maybe it's too much to ask with the full bind. Core is still pulling in because my back is doing a side bend right now. And then you could practice extending the leg, which is obviously very difficult because my arm is kind of blocking it a little bit. And it's a lot of controlled flexibility. To come down, I don't just want to flop out of this. I want to come down mindfully. You could, of course, release the bind if it's too much. Put one hand on your hip, or you could keep the bind. Bend this leg. It's a lot of strength coming down too. Let this foot touch down. Give it some weight. Release your bind and forward fold. I like to do shoulder extension in between. You could also do the strap between the hands like we did in the class. Let me go back through the other side through the same steps and show you a front view instead of a side view. Forward fold, widening the feet. I'm gonna hug this right leg this time, which means my back has to be kind of turned against it. So I'm gonna get my right arm through my legs, just reaching. Just that. And then I gotta
internally rotate my shoulder so my palm turns out away from my mat.
So I apologize about this, but the microphone was really clipping for some reason when I was on this side for the next 30 seconds just about. So I'm going to voice over through this part. But here I'm showing you that I'm reaching through with the arm. I have to internally rotate the shoulder, and then it's just a matter of bending at the elbow, and your hand should end up wherever it's going to end up, by your hip, by your thigh. And then you can reach around with the other arm. So I'm reaching up here. I have to do the same thing. Internally rotate the shoulder. The palm faces back. And then it bends at the elbow. The arm bends at the elbow. And I search for that back hand. And you find it or you don't. And you can use a strap to bridge that gap in between. So I'm just showing you there. I'm trying to show you with my hands that I could have a strap or a long towel in between to make that connection, because it can make it easier if you can close this loop around your leg.
Once I'm there, I can just be there, or I could shift my weight to my standing leg, come to the toes of the right leg, mentally prepare, pull in my core, bend the standing leg, push the floor away. My leg is going to externally rotate, the one that's up in the air. My shoulder is being pushed forward on that side too. Oops. And I could just work here in this stage, or I could work on extending my leg, keeping the bind, the full bind, or maybe the half bind all the while. I could just bend and extend, bend and extend. Of course, bird of paradise, the full thing, is where your leg is extended out. Do you see how I have to lean to the side too? Because doing it this way, it's really difficult. I could, but it's a lot of glute strength. So I'm not opposed to a little bit of abduction here to make it slightly easier. And then to come down mindfully, I can look at the floor, keep my bind or release half of it, pull in the core, come down slow. I'm going to rotate my body this way. I'm not going to come down facing straight. I'm going to rotate to keep my shoulder happy, okay? So do you see that as I come down, my body rotates? Kind of like it was in the twist, because it's going to push on my shoulder a lot less, the weight of this leg. Then I come down, can release the bind, free my shoulders, forward fold, maybe do, shoulder extension, because it's the opposite of what you were doing. And just my opinion, since this is such a challenging, demanding pose, I wouldn't do much more after this. I wouldn't do a lot of chaturangas or shoulder stuff after this pose. I would give your shoulders a chance to recover after Bird of Paradise. Another pose which is more modern and has a relationship to several of these poses is called super soldier. I don't know how that became its moniker, because the Sanskrit is Viparita Parivrita Surya Yantrasana. Some of that should sound sort of familiar, because Parivrita Surya Yantrasana is compass pose, and Viparita means inverted. So it's like inverted compass pose. So super soldier looks like this. Look like fun? So you might have thought that when I was setting up for that, it kind of looked like the Bird of Paradise setup, where you get your arm through your leg, and that's because it is. The way you set up for inverted compass pose is that first krama, and then you saw that one leg was shelved on the floor, and then the other one was up in the air, but I caught it with my arm. So there's a lot of things going on in this pose. It's got similar feelings to standing split, except that you're holding your foot back there. As preparatory poses or movements, I would do Ardha Hanuman, half split and lunge, back and forth,
like we did at the very beginning of this section. I would do the Uttanasana twist, this. You could even just get used to like reaching through the legs like this, one arm at a time, right? Really reaching forward and back, forward and back. And also half moon. Half moon might be a great way to prepare your hips. And if you wanted to get fancy with half moon, you could bend the top leg and attempt to bind with the top leg because it feels pretty similar to what's happening in this pose. Just to make that super clear, you could practice half moon. Obviously not first. I would do those other things first. Reaching through the legs, Ardha Hanuman and the lunge. You could practice half moon. You could practice binding with the top leg, maybe using a strap. Carefully coming down. So if you would like to play with this pose, let me give you some clear kramas or stages through which you can progress and play with this, okay? The key word is play. So let's say I'm going to shelf this leg, my left leg. So first I would take my left arm, reach underneath, and get it onto the floor back there. So I'm bending my legs, getting it down onto the floor. It doesn't have to be by my foot. This hand is actually going to be off the floor eventually, so just get it shelved and back somewhere. And this leg is going to be the one that stays on the ground, the one I'm shelving. So this could be krama 1. I'm going to shift my weight to my left leg. Legs are bent. And then I'm going to bend my right leg. So this could be like krama 2. Right hand stays down, left foot stays down. I can take this arm that I reached through and shelved with to grab that foot that I just lifted up. So opposite hand to opposite foot, I'm grabbing. I'm going to take my hand and foot unit that I've got and lift them up together. Whoa. So now I've got like compass going on. This is like practicing compass upside down. At least what's going on in my bottom shoulder and that leg. My shoulder is against my leg. I'm rotated, right? Can you see that? How my upper body is rotated? To come down, I'm going to let go of my foot, slowly bring it down, bend my left leg, free my shoulder, and I'm just going to sit down. Might have been hard to see from that angle, so I'm going to do it with a posterior view as well. So just forgive me for that, but I think it'll be easier to understand. I'm going to reach through with my left arm. I'm going to put it on the floor somewhere. It doesn't exactly matter because this hand is going to be the one grabbing this foot in a second. I'm going to shift my weight to this leg, my left leg, the one I'm shelving. This other leg can bend. Okay, so this could be like krama 2. I can now grab, depends on your proportions though. I can attempt to grab my foot with this left hand, the one that I just reached back with. The right hand stays on the floor, and I'm kind of reaching forward with it. All right, now what? Now I'm grabbing my foot with my hand. I'm going to lift my knee up. See how I'm doing that? So it starts down, lift my knee. That's all that's happening. Doesn't mean that it's easy, but that's what's going on. I'm lifting, pulling in my core, because now I'm twisting in my spine. To come down, bend the knee, let go of your foot, untwist. Probably would be nice to do child's pose and maybe puppy pose after that. Just, you know, things that are symmetrical and the opposite of what the pose does. You could see how at least you were doing this kind of part of compass. You just flipped it over, right? So this is another instance where we have a shape, like the compass pose shape, but now this part that was upwards was facing downwards. It can help you challenge your body's movements in different ways. Like, of course, these are all challenging, but you're challenged in different ways depending on what's loaded, what's not loaded, and what your orientation to gravity is. Even though this module is not about sequencing, when you're
practicing poses, I think it's important to talk about counterposing. So think about what's going on in that pose. You have got spinal flexion going on, so you're rounded. You've got internal rotation of your shoulders. So it's nice to do things that are the opposite of that, but also things that counterpose the effort. So if you're in a pose that requires a lot of effort, you can also counterpose with energy. As an example, you could do upward plank, which brings your spine into some extension and your shoulders into some extension, but it's hard pose too. And I like to think about counterposing not just the body movements, but counterposing the effort. And this one is asymmetrical, so I would do something symmetrical and simple. Things like puppy pose, things like supported fish pose, things like child's pose, things like shavasana or sphinx pose. Just play around with those ideas when you're counterposing. So of course, these aren't the only poses that ask for a lot of hip mobility and hip flexibility, but in terms of the challenge and the complexity of the poses, I think these ones are really up there as being advanced in that way, very physically challenging. Of course, I would move from more simple explorations to more complex explorations, and I would, workshop one pose at a time, and that way you can start to put the pieces together when you get into some of these more combination and complex postures. So next we're going to be moving into the back bend section, which of course requires a lot of opening and flexibility, just kind of higher up generally in the body. And so I'm going to first start with a class to prepare you for those back bends, and we'll have some lecture content, and then we will do some breakdowns of these advanced back bends.